In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd threw a rock into a cave along the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea and heard something shatter. What he had stumbled upon would become the most significant manuscript discovery in the history of archaeology. The Dead Sea Scroll, thousands of fragments representing hundreds of ancient texts, some of them predating the oldest known copies of biblical books by 1,000 years. Scholars descended on the region, governments fought over access. Decades of translation work followed, and in the careful, painstaking reconstruction of those brittle Aramaic fragments, something deeply unexpected emerged from the rubble of antiquity, a text that did not simply interpret the ancient world, a text that the ancient world had tried, across multiple centuries and multiple empires, to destroy completely. It was called the Book of Giants. Most people who have heard of it at all know it only as a footnote, a curiosity attached to the more famous Book of Enoch. That is by design. The institutional suppression of this particular text was not accidental, not the passive result of time and neglect. It was methodical, it was thorough, and it nearly worked. To understand why so many powerful institutions across so many different civilizations expended such enormous energy trying to erase a single document, you have to begin not with the theology it contains, but with the archaeology of its survival, because the story of what this text says is inseparable from the story of why it was hunted. The fragments recovered from Cave 4 at Qumran represent the oldest known physical copies of the Book of Giants, dating to somewhere between the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE. They are written in Aramaic, the common tongue of the ancient Near East, and they are fragmentary in the way that all ancient manuscripts eventually become, broken, incomplete, requiring scholarly reconstruction to bridge the gaps between surviving pieces. John C. Reeves, one of the foremost academic authorities on the text, spent years working through the Qumran material and establishing its relationship to what had been discovered on the other side of the world. Because here is the thing that elevates the Book of Giants from merely interesting to genuinely staggering. It was not only found at Qumran, it had also survived in an entirely different form, in an entirely different language, in an entirely different civilization, thousands of miles to the east. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, European expedition teams exploring the Turfan Basin in what is now the Xinjiang region of northwestern China began extracting manuscripts from cave complexes and ruined monastery sites buried beneath the desert. The Turfan oasis had once been a major node along the Silk Road, a crossroads of culture, commerce, and religion, where Buddhist monks, Zoroastrian merchants, Nestorian Christians, and the followers of a Persian prophet named Mani all coexisted in proximity. Among the tens of thousands of manuscript fragments pulled from those sites were texts written in Middle Persian and Old Uyghur, and when scholars began working through them, they found fragments of the Book of Giants, not copies of the Qumran text, not translations of the Aramaic, an evolved, elaborated version of the same core narrative, expanded by centuries of transmission and theological development, carrying the same characters, the same prophetic visions, the same uncompromising verdict, preserved on the opposite end of the known world from where it had first been written down. A text that had been banned from the Jewish canon, excluded from the Christian scriptural tradition, and later systematically persecuted by imperial decree, had somehow crossed the entirety of the ancient world and survived in monastery ruins in a Chinese desert. That fact alone demands explanation. But to understand the transmission, you have to understand the content. And the content begins with a problem that has no easy resolution: the problem of what the Book of Giants actually claims about human history. The ancient Mesopotamian literary tradition is one of the oldest on Earth. The Sumerians, who built their civilization in the river valleys between the Tigris and the Euphrates thousands of years before the Common Era, produced a body of literature that saturated the entire ancient Near East. Their myths, their king lists, their heroic epics became the cultural substrate upon which every subsequent civilization in the region built. The figure of Gilgamesh, the legendary king of Uruk, was among the most widely known characters in the ancient world. His epic, which in its written form dates to approximately the 18th century BCE, told the story of a partially divine ruler who sought immortality after witnessing the death of his companion Enkidu, who journeyed to the ends of the earth, who faced the monster of the cedar forest named Humbaba, and who ultimately returned home changed, mortal, finite. It was a story about the human condition. It was taught, copied, translated, and venerated across Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Levant for millennia. The The Book of Giants takes Gilgamesh and places him inside an entirely different cosmological framework. In the fragments recovered from both Qumran and Turfan, Gilgamesh is not a king on a heroic journey. He is a giant. He is one of the Nephilim, the monstrous hybrid offspring born in the antediluvian age, and he is named alongside another figure. The text calls Hobabish, widely identified by scholars as a variant rendering of Humbaba. Both of them are portrayed as beings of enormous power and destructive capacity who are caught, along with all the other giants of their age, in the inexorable machinery of a divine judgment they cannot escape and cannot understand. The implications of this identification are not merely theological. They are political and historical in a way that would have been immediately legible to any ancient reader familiar with the Mesopotamian tradition. Gilgamesh was not a mythological abstraction to the people of the ancient Near East. He was, according to the Sumerian king list, a historical ruler, the fifth king of the first dynasty of Uruk after the flood. He was a figure whose legacy had been carefully managed and ideologically weaponized by Mesopotamian rulers for thousands of years. Kings in Babylon, Assyria, and across the region invoked Gilgamesh to legitimize their own authority. He was the gold standard of ancient kingship, two-thirds divine, one-third human, a builder of walls, a slayer of monsters, a ruler whose power was a gift of the gods. To name Gilgamesh as one of the condemned giants of the antediluvian age, to place him not among the honored heroes of human civilization, but among the beings whose violence and corruption necessitated the destruction of the entire world, was a direct attack on the entire ideological architecture of Mesopotamian kingship. It was not a theological footnote. It was a declaration that the most celebrated figure in ancient Near Eastern culture was in fact a condemned criminal, a creature born of forbidden union, a being whose existence was an aberration that the cosmos itself had moved to correct. Any ruler who traced their legitimacy to the Gilgamesh tradition, any priest who maintained that tradition's sacred texts, any institution whose authority rested on the cultural prestige of the Mesopotamian legacy, had a direct and urgent interest in suppressing the Book of Giants. The text did not simply offer an alternative reading of ancient history. It inverted the moral polarity of the entire heroic tradition. But the text does something even more remarkable than simply renaming Gilgamesh. It takes us inside his world. It takes us inside the inner lives of the giants themselves, and what it shows us there is not triumph. It is not power. It is not the swagger of beings who believed themselves beyond consequence. What the surviving fragments of the Book of Giants reveal is a community of enormous, technologically capable, physically overwhelming beings who are absolutely terrified, who are dreaming terrible dreams they cannot interpret, who are watching their world disintegrate and finding, for the first time in their existence, that there is nothing they can do about it. The nightmare sequences in the Book of Giants are among the most psychologically vivid passages in all of ancient apocalyptic literature. Two of the primary giant figures, brothers named Ohya and Hahya, are the first to receive the visions. Ohya's dream is recorded in the fragments with particular intensity. He sees a massive garden, a vast cultivated space that represents ordered life and the dominion of the giants over the earth, and he watches as a being of extraordinary authority moves through it with absolute deliberateness, uprooting every tree, not destroying them in a fire, not scattering them in a storm, but uprooting them with intention, one after another, a systematic dismantling of everything the garden contains. Only one tree remains at the end of the dream, and when Ohya awakes, he does not know what it means, but he knows it is catastrophic. The second vision involves a stone tablet on which writing is inscribed. In the ancient world, to write something on stone was to make it permanent. Stone tablets were used for royal decrees, for legal codes, for covenants between parties of enormous power. The Mesopotamian tradition itself associated the fate of the world with the tablets of destiny, physical objects whose inscription determined what would happen in the cosmic order. In Hahya's vision, the stone tablet is being scraped, the writing is being removed, the permanent record is being unmade. Everything written there, which in context represents the giants themselves, their names, their existence, their place in the order of things, is being erased as systematically as Ohya's garden was being uprooted. What makes these visions so psychologically devastating within the text is not simply what they show. It is who is experiencing them. These are not weak beings trembling at forces beyond their comprehension. The giants of the Book of Giants are described in terms that ancient readers would have associated with the apex of earthly power. They are physically immense. They have numbers. They have strength that no ordinary human or army can match. In the cosmological framework of the text, they are also beings with a connection to the divine through their parentage, the children of the Watchers, the fallen angels who came to earth and created them. And yet against what these dreams are pointing toward, none of that matters. Their size is useless. Their strength is irrelevant. The divine machinery moving against them is not impressed by anything they are or anything they can do. The fragments describe the giants gathering to discuss what they have seen. They compare visions. They argue about interpretation. They try to find a reading of the dreams that does not mean what the dreams clearly mean. And when they cannot, when the weight of the symbolic language becomes undeniable, they make a decision that reveals something extraordinary about the cosmological logic of the text. They decide to send a messenger to find Enoch. This is remarkable for several reasons. Enoch, in the tradition that surrounds the Book of Giants, is a human being. He is a human being who, according to the Genesis tradition, never died, who was taken directly to the divine realm while still alive, who was given access to cosmic knowledge unavailable to ordinary mortals. But he is still human. And the giants, these beings of overwhelming physical power and partially divine heritage, decide that their only hope lies with a human intermediary. They need someone who can navigate the space between their world and the divine court. They need someone who can carry their petition upward and bring back an answer. And the only candidate they can identify is a mortal man who walked with God. The messenger they choose for this task is named Mawe. He is himself a giant, the son of one of the Watchers, a being of extraordinary capability. The text describes his journey to find Enoch in terms that draw on the full weight of ancient cosmological imagery. He crosses vast distances. He moves between different registers of reality. He is, in the logic of the narrative, doing something that requires tremendous effort and perhaps tremendous courage, because to seek out Enoch is to seek out judgment. To send a petition to the divine court through an intermediary is to formally acknowledge that the divine court has authority over you, and for beings who have spent their entire existence dominating everything around them, that acknowledgement is its own kind of defeat. When Mawe finally finds Enoch, the encounter is not the negotiation the giants were hoping for. Enoch does not come back with a compromise. He does not bring word of a conditional pardon or a reduced sentence. The fragments that record this exchange preserve one of the most uncompromising passages in ancient apocalyptic literature. Enoch's message, delivered on behalf of the divine court, does not leave room for interpretation. The giants will not survive what is coming. Their petition has been heard, and the answer is no. The judgment stands. The garden will be uprooted entirely. Every tree will come down. The stone tablet will be scraped clean of every name written there. What Enoch delivers is not a divine punishment in the simple sense of a penalty for wrongdoing. The text frames it as something more like a cosmological correction. The giants' existence is the problem, not just their behavior. Their very presence in the world represents a corruption of the order of things, a mixing of categories that should never have mixed, a line that was crossed in the heavens long before they were born, and whose consequences now have to be resolved by the elimination of everything that crossing produced. The giants did not choose to be born. They did not choose their nature, and none of that matters to the judgment. The dream was always pointing toward this. This is the theological core that made the Book of Giants so dangerous to so many different institutional powers across so many centuries. It is not a text that says the powerful will be punished for their crimes and the righteous will be rewarded. It is a text that says entire categories of existence can be condemned, that the judgment of the divine court is not subject to appeal or negotiation, that size and strength and divine parentage offer exactly zero protection against a cosmic verdict, and that even beings of overwhelming worldly power are ultimately as helpless before the architecture of divine justice as anyone else. That message, carried in a concrete narrative with named characters and vivid imagery, was subversive in a way that abstract theology never quite manages to be. The text circulated in Jewish communities during the Second Temple period, appearing in the same manuscript tradition as the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and other texts that represented an older, wilder, more cosmologically expansive form of Israelite religion than what eventually became Rabbinic Judaism. When the rabbinical authorities began the process of defining the canonical scriptures in the centuries around the destruction of the Second Temple, these texts were systematically excluded. The Book of Enoch did not make it into the Hebrew canon. The Book of Giants, even more dramatically cosmic in its claims, even more politically charged in its specific identification of Gilgamesh, certainly did not. They were not simply unpopular texts that faded from use. They were texts that surviving institutional Judaism made a deliberate choice not to carry forward. But the texts did not disappear. They moved. And the person most responsible for the extraordinary geographic spread of the Book of Giants is a figure named Mani, born in Babylonia in 26 CE, to a family connected to an ascetic Jewish Christian sect called the Elkasites. From a very early age, Mani experienced visions that he interpreted as divine revelation, and by the time he reached adulthood, he had developed a comprehensive religious system that he explicitly presented as the final and definitive revelation superseding all previous ones. He called himself the Paraclete, the Apostle of Light, the figure whose coming Jesus and Zoroaster and the Buddha had each in their own traditions anticipated. What he built became known as Manichaeism, and it was, for several centuries, one of the most geographically expansive religions on earth. Mani was a systematic thinker with an extraordinary gift for synthesis. He traveled extensively through the Sasanian Persian Empire and into the Indian subcontinent, gathering texts, debating philosophers, building a community of followers organized around a hierarchy of the elect and the hearers. And among the texts he encountered and integrated into his emerging canonical tradition was the Book of Giants. He did not simply preserve it, he expanded it. The Middle Persian and Uyghur fragments found in the Turfan Basin represent a Manichaean version of the text that has been elaborated with additional theological content, additional narrative detail, additional framing that situates the story of the giants within the broader Manichaean cosmological system, a system built around the eternal war between light and darkness, in which the material world represents the imprisonment of particles of divine light within corrupt matter, and in which salvation consists of the gradual liberation of those particles back into the realm of pure light. Within this framework, the giants of the Book of Giants became something specific and important. They were the extreme product of darkness, beings of maximal material power, beings of appetite and destruction, beings whose domination of the physical world represented the darkest possible expression of what happens when matter is left to its own devices without the organizing principle of light. Their annihilation was not simply a divine punishment. It was a cosmological event, a stage in the long war between light and darkness, a necessary clearing of ground that had become completely saturated with the forces of the material and the corrupt. Mani's version of the text charged these ancient narratives with new theological voltage and inserted them into a global missionary project. Manichaeism spread along the Silk Road with extraordinary speed. The religion was designed for transmission. Mani himself composed his texts in several languages simultaneously, understanding that a religion that wanted to be universal could not afford to be linguistically provincial. His missionaries traveled east through Persia into Central Asia, where the Silk Road's network of oasis cities created natural points of contact and community formation. By the 7th century, Manichaean communities existed from North Africa and Spain in the west to the oasis cities of the Tarim Basin in the east. The text of the Book of Giants traveled with them, copied into whatever languages the local communities used, preserved in whatever manuscript traditions were available, carried in the baggage of merchants and missionaries who understood it as part of the sacred deposit of their tradition. But every step of this expansion was contested. Mani himself did not survive his success. He had initially enjoyed the patronage of the Sasanian king Shapur I, who was curious about religious movements and willing to tolerate heterodox thinkers. When Shapur's successor Bahram I came to power, Mani's relationship with the court deteriorated. The Zoroastrian priestly establishment, the Magi, had always viewed him as a dangerous competitor, and under Bahram I they succeeded in having him arrested. Manichaean custody around 276 or 277 CE, and immediately after his death, the Sasanian authorities began a systematic persecution of his followers. Manichaean clergy were executed, their texts were confiscated and destroyed. Communities were dispersed. The pattern had begun. In the Roman Empire, Manichaeism arrived in the late 3rd century and was immediately identified as a threat by the imperial establishment. The Emperor Diocletian issued an edict against the Manichaeans around 32 CE before the Edict of Milan that would legalize Christianity, which tells you something significant about how the Roman authorities prioritized their religious anxieties. Diocletian's decree described the Manichaeans in terms that mixed genuine theological concern with political anxiety. They were foreign, They were Persian in origin, which made them suspect during a period of Roman-Persian conflict, and their radical dualism was seen as corrosive to the social and moral fabric that Roman religion was supposed to underwrite. The decree ordered that Manichaean leaders be burned along with their book. When Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire under Theodosius at the end of the 4th century, the persecution of Manichaeism intensified rather than relaxed. The early unified church had its own urgent reasons for wanting Manichaeism destroyed. The two religions shared an enormous amount of surface-level vocabulary. Both spoke of light and darkness, both centered on a figure of divine revelation, both promised salvation from the material world, and this superficial resemblance made Manichaeism extraordinarily dangerous from the perspective of Christian orthodoxy. Augustine of Hippo, one of the most influential theologians in the history of Western Christianity, had himself been a Manichaean hearer for 9 years before his conversion to Christianity. He knew the tradition from the inside, and he spent a significant portion of his subsequent theological career systematically demolishing Manichaean arguments, producing a body of anti-Manichaean polemic that shaped Christian heresiological writing for centuries. The threat was not just theological abstraction. If Manichaeism could claim to be the final revelation, if it could plausibly present Jesus as a figure within its cosmological system rather than the exclusive center of the divine economy, then the Church's claim to unique authority was compromised. The Book of Giants, as a Manichaean sacred text, carried within it a vision of sacred history that was entirely incompatible with the scriptural canon the Church was in the process of finalizing. Its vision of condemned giants, its identification of Gilgamesh as a Nephilim, its account of Enoch as a cosmic intermediary operating in a framework far more elaborate than the 2 verses Genesis devotes to him, none of this could be accommodated. The text had to be not just rejected, but destroyed, because as long as copies existed, the alternative vision of sacred history existed with them. Imperial edicts followed. Manichaean texts were to be surrendered and burned. Possessing them was a crime. Being a Manichaean was, at various points in the history of the Roman Empire and its Byzantine successor, a capital offense. The thoroughness of this destruction is reflected in the historical record, or rather, in its absence. We know an enormous amount about Manichaeism from anti-Manichaean sources, from Augustine's polemics, from imperial edicts, from the reports of enemies. We know very little from primary Manichaean texts in the western part of the empire, because almost none of them survived. The Book of Giants, in its Manichaean form, was simply not supposed to exist anywhere west of Persia, but the Silk Road was long, and the Tang dynasty was not Rome. Manichaean missionaries reached China by the 7th century CE, and for a period they enjoyed a measure of toleration that was simply unavailable in the western parts of the former Roman world. The Tang dynasty was, at its height, one of the most cosmopolitan and confident civilizations on earth. Chang'an, the Tang capital, was a genuinely international city where Buddhist monks, Nestorian Christians, Zoroastrian priests, Jewish merchants, and Islamic scholars all maintained communities. Religious novelty was not automatically frightening to Tang administrators. What was frightening was political disruption, and for a time, the Manichaeans were careful enough to avoid triggering that anxiety. The equilibrium did not last. In 843 CE, the Tang Emperor Wuzong launched a comprehensive suppression of foreign religions that targeted Buddhism, Nestorianism, Zoroastrianism, and Manichaeism simultaneously. Manichaean monasteries were destroyed. Clergy were killed or forced to return to secular life. Texts were confiscated. The physical infrastructure of the Manichaean tradition in China was systematically dismantled in a matter of years. What survived did so because some communities were far enough from the centers of imperial power to escape immediate notice, or because their texts were hidden before the authorities arrived, or because the desert conditions of the Turfan Basin preserved what human destruction left behind. The Turfan site itself represents a kind of accidental archive, a place where the organized violence of suppression met the equally organized accident of climate. The extremely arid conditions of the region, with almost no annual precipitation and temperatures that swing wildly between seasons, created a preservation environment that allowed organic materials to survive for over a millennium. Manuscripts that would have rotted in more temperate environments held together. The paper and parchment and wooden tablets buried in the ruins of monasteries the Tang authorities had destroyed remained legible 1,000 years later when German and British and Russian expedition teams began excavating them at the turn of the 20th century. The Book of Giants survived not because it was protected by any institution or any ideology, but because the desert preserved what the empire thought it had eliminated. The dual discovery of the text, at Qumran in the Judean desert and in the Turfan Basin in Central Asia, separated by thousands of miles and several centuries of transmission history, is itself an argument for the text's significance. These are not two copies of the same manuscript that happen to end up in different places through normal processes of commercial book trade or scholarly exchange. They are representatives of entirely different transmission streams, entirely different institutional contexts, entirely different theological elaborations of a core narrative that was apparently compelling enough to be carried across the entire span of the ancient world by communities that had no direct contact with each other. The Qumran community that preserved the Aramaic fragments were Jewish ascetics living near the Dead Sea, probably members of the sect historians call the Essenes, a group that existed in deliberate separation from the Jerusalem temple establishment and that preserved texts the mainstream tradition had rejected. The Manichaean monks who copied the Turfan fragments were the heirs of a Persian prophet's universal mission, carrying a cosmological system that had absorbed Jewish, Christian, Zoroastrian, and Buddhist elements into a single synthetic framework. What connected them was the story itself, the specific, irreducible narrative of beings of overwhelming power, dreaming of their own destruction and finding, in the face of that destruction, that all their power was completely useless. There is something about that story that clearly resonated across enormous cultural and temporal distances. It spoke to something that multiple different civilizations recognized as true, or at least as meaningful, even as the institutional authorities of those civilizations worked continuously to prevent it from being read. The fragments we have today are incomplete. Scholars estimate that we have recovered enough to reconstruct the broad outlines of the text and many of its specific episodes, but significant portions are still missing, still buried somewhere, still dissolved into fragments too small to identify, or lost entirely in the fires that centuries of imperial suppression set. What we can read is fragmentary in both the physical and the interpretive sense. The Aramaic Qumran fragments are sometimes just a few lines, a proper name, a phrase, a partial vision. The Middle Persian and Uyghur Turfan fragments are more elaborate, but are themselves the products of centuries of theological development, and cannot simply be read back onto the earlier text without accounting for what Mani and his followers added. And yet what survives is enough to make the erasure itself legible. You can trace the outline of what was destroyed by the shape of the gap it left. You can see the Book of Giants haunting the edges of the canonical tradition, in the passing references the Book of Enoch makes to the giants and their fate, in the fragments of other Second Temple period texts that seem to allude to a narrative they do not fully explain, in the anti-Manichaean polemics that describe in detail the teachings they were trying to refute. The text left marks in its absence, the way a removed object leaves a clean patch in a wall of accumulated grime. What we're left with, ultimately, is a text that was never supposed to survive at all. It was removed from the Jewish canon before the canon was finalized. It was condemned by the Roman Empire and the early church. It was suppressed by the Sasanian authorities who killed its primary transmitter. It was eventually targeted for destruction by the Tang dynasty on the other side of the world. Every significant institutional power that encountered it decided it needed to be destroyed, and not one of them entirely succeeded. The fragments that emerged from a Judean cave in 1947 and from a Chinese desert at the turn of the previous century are the survivors of one of the longest and most geographically comprehensive censorship operations in human history. They survived because the desert is indifferent to imperial decrees. They survived because the communities that valued them hid them carefully enough that the persecutions passed over without finding everything. They survived because human beings have a persistent tendency to preserve the things that powerful institutions tell them to burn, and because the story of beings who dreamed of their own annihilation and could do nothing to prevent it is apparently a story that speaks to something deep enough in human experience that no amount of official suppression can fully silence it. The giants dreamed of the garden being uprooted. They watched the stone tablet being scraped clean of every name. They sent their fastest messenger to the one man who might be able to intercede, and they received back an answer that allowed for no negotiation, no modification, no delay. The judgment was final. The order of the cosmos would be restored. And the Book of Giants, the text that recorded their terror and their helplessness and their desperate petition, was itself nearly uprooted along with them, nearly scraped from the record of human knowledge as completely as the Hahya's vision had promised. Nearly, but not completely, because here we are, reading it.